Eleanor Crow. Feather stopped mid-step, her weathered hand gripping the grocery list as the auctioneer's voice cut through the autumn air like a blade. 3 orphans, sold as is, no names, no questions asked. The burlap sacks weren't covering grain or potatoes. They were tied over 3 small heads, the children standing motionless as livestock on the auction block. The crowd murmured approval, as if this were cattle, not children, while Eleanor's coffee-stained list fluttered to the dusty ground. A woman behind her whispered, "Finally, someone's cleaning up the Indian problem," and Eleanor's stomach lurched. Then the smallest child, no more than 7, turned his sack-covered head directly toward her and whispered words that made her blood freeze. "Grandmother Eleanor." The name floated across the square in perfect Lakota, spoken by a boy who couldn't possibly know her, couldn't possibly see her, couldn't possibly exist in her childless world. The auctioneer's hammer hung suspended in the October air. How did this broken child know her deepest, most guarded secret, that she'd always dreamed of being called grandmother? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor Crow. Feather had buried her husband 3 winters ago in the hard Colorado ground, and with him, any hope of the children they'd never had. At 52, she lived alone in a cabin 2 miles outside Silverton, surviving on a widow's pension of $50 a month and the occasional sale of medicinal herbs she gathered from the mountain slopes. Her half-Lakota heritage had always made her an outsider in the mining town, but widowhood had rendered her nearly invisible. The cabin sat where the pine trees grew thick and the creek ran fast, a place her husband Jacob had chosen because it reminded him of his childhood in Minnesota. Now, the silence pressed against her like a physical weight. She set 2 plates for dinner every evening out of habit, then put one back with hands that trembled just slightly. The rocking chair on the porch still creaked in rhythm with the wind, as if someone invisible sat beside her, keeping her company through the long mountain nights. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the bedroom lay $2,847, Jacob's life insurance money that she'd never touched. Blood money, she called it. Payment for a man crushed by falling mine timber because the company cut corners on safety supports. Every time she counted those bills, she heard his voice saying the words from his last letter written the day before the accident. "Eleanor, if something happens to me, help the children no one else will help." She'd lost their only pregnancy 20 years ago, a grief that carved a hollow space in her chest that never quite healed. "When God closes a door, He opens a window," the preacher had said. But Eleanor had been waiting 2 decades for that window to appear. She filled her days with small rituals, gathering sage and wild mint, reading Jacob's books aloud to the empty house, writing letters to relatives who rarely wrote back. Silverton itself was a study in contradictions, a town of 2,000 souls perched at 9,300 feet, where silver money created instant millionaires while Native American families were driven from their ancestral lands. The railroad had arrived 2 years earlier, bringing prosperity and problems in equal measure. Child labor was legal and common. Boys as young as 10 worked the mines. Girls, barely older, served in wealthy households, and Native children disappeared into government boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. Eleanor had witnessed the gradual erosion of her people's way of life, but she'd felt powerless to stop it. Her own mixed heritage made her suspect to both communities. Too Indian for the white townspeople, too assimilated for the traditional Lakota. She existed in the spaces between, tending her small garden, brewing her healing teas, and wondering if this half-life of quiet desperation was all she'd ever know. The morning she'd walked into town for supplies, she'd had no intention of stopping at the town square. But something, call it instinct, call it destiny, had pulled her toward the sound of the auctioneer's voice and changed everything. Eleanor's $50 felt like paper in her trembling hands as she stepped forward through the crowd. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth, looked surprised when she raised her hand. $50 for all three, she called out, her voice steadier than her nerves. Ma'am, the bidding starts at 20 each. 50 for all three, she repeated, louder this time. The crowd murmured disapproval. These weren't the kind of children respectable families wanted. Too old, too damaged, too Indian. The auctioneer shrugged and brought down his hammer. Sold to the widow. The walk home felt eternal. The boys sat in the back of her wagon like fragile cargo, the burlap sacks still covering their heads. Eleanor didn't remove them. Some instinct told her they needed to choose that moment themselves. Instead, she spoke softly about the mountains, the cabin, the creek that ran behind the house where they could wash if they wanted. At home, she set out bread, dried meat, and milk without asking if they were hungry. Children this thin were always hungry. She pointed to the sacks. You can take those off when you're ready. No one's going to hurt you here. The oldest boy was first. His hands shook as he untied the rough twine, revealing a face too serious for his 12 years. Dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his eyes held the guarded wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust. I'm Samuel Running Bear, he said quietly. The middle boy followed suit, showing a face marked by recent bruises. Thomas Swift Arrow. His voice carried a slight accent that spoke of languages being beaten out of him in some government school. The youngest kept his sack on longest, small hands clutching the fabric. When he finally pulled it away, Eleanor's breath caught. He had the ancient eyes of someone much older, and when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. William Little Wolf, he whispered. Then, in perfect Lakota, Grandmother Eleanor, the spirit said you would come. Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. How do you know my name, child? William tilted his head, as if listening to voices only he could hear. My grandmother came to me in dreams. She said there was a woman with crow feathers in her hair who smelled like sage and had hands that remembered holding babies. She said you were waiting for us, just like we were waiting for you. The other boys exchanged glances. Samuel spoke carefully, as if he'd had to protect William from his own gifts before. He has dreams sometimes, about things that haven't happened yet, or things that have happened but we don't know about them. Eleanor felt tears she'd held back for years threatening to spill. She'd worn crow feathers in her hair at her wedding, a nod to her Lakota grandmother. She did smell like sage from the herbs she gathered. And her hands. Her empty hands had ached for 20 years with the memory of the child she'd lost. Are you hungry? She asked, instead of addressing the impossible. They ate like wolves, but quietly, efficiently, without the messiness of children who'd always known where their next meal was coming from. Eleanor watched them and saw herself in their careful movements, the way they checked for escape routes, the way they kept their backs to walls, the way they didn't quite believe in safety even when they were experiencing it. Where did you come from? She asked gently. Samuel answered for all of them. Different places, government schools, mines, families that didn't want us anymore. They collect us when we become problems. Too old, too sick, too Indian. And they sell you. It's legal, Thomas said bitterly. Indenture contracts? We're bound laborers until we're 18 or until we die, whichever comes first. Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. Not anymore? You're free here. People don't just give freedom away, Samuel said. What do you want from us? The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor looked at these 3 broken boys who'd somehow found their way to her kitchen table, and she thought about Jacob's last words, About 20 years of emptiness, about $50 that might as well have been her entire world. "I want you to live," she said simply. "I want you to be children instead of property. I want you to remember what it feels like to be safe." William reached across the table and touched her hand with fingers that felt like bird bones. "Grandmother says that's what love looks like." That night, Eleanor made beds for them near the fireplace. Not because she didn't trust them in the other rooms, but because she sensed they needed to feel the warmth, to know they weren't locked away somewhere dark and cold. As she tucked blankets around them, she whispered the Lakota lullaby her own grandmother had sung, words she hadn't spoken in decades. For the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel empty. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Eleanor had brought the boys home. No postmark, no signature, just her name written in careful script on cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of tobacco and leather. Inside, the message was brief and chilling. "Return the property or face legal consequences. You have 7 days. J.B." Eleanor burned the letter in the kitchen stove, but not before the boys saw her hands trembling as she fed it to the flames. Samuel's jaw tightened with a familiar wariness, while Thomas instinctively moved closer to the window to watch for threats. William simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Samuel asked quietly. Eleanor met his eyes. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But her confidence cracked 3 days later when the black carriage rolled up her drive. She'd been teaching the boys to read using Jacob's old books when the sound of hoofbeats made them all freeze. Through the window she watched a tall man in an expensive coat step down from the carriage, his movements deliberate and predatory. "Judge Joshua Blackwood," he introduced himself when Eleanor opened the door, his smile never reaching his cold blue eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to the territorial court." "These children belong to themselves," Eleanor replied, not inviting him inside. The judge's laugh was like ice cracking. "Mrs. Crow-Feather, sentiment is admirable, but it doesn't change law. These boys are wards of the court, bound by legal indenture contracts. By harboring them, you're committing a federal crime." He produced a folder thick with official-looking documents, each bearing territorial seals and signatures. "The penalty for interfering with lawful indenture arrangements is $500 or 6 months in territorial prison. A woman of your circumstances would find either option rather challenging." Eleanor's heart sank as she scanned the papers. They looked legitimate, complete with photographs of the boys and detailed descriptions of their placement requirements. Samuel's file noted his tendency toward violence and insubordination. Thomas was classified as requiring firm guidance to overcome savage instincts. William's paperwork was the most disturbing, marked as mentally deficient due to persistent hallucinations and spiritual delusions. "However," Judge Blackwood continued, his tone becoming almost paternal, "I'm a reasonable man. I understand you meant well. If you pay the administrative processing fee of $200, I can arrange for the boys to remain here under proper legal guardianship. Think of it as adoption through appropriate channels." $200, Eleanor's entire pension for 4 months. Money she didn't have unless she touched Jacob's insurance payment, the blood money she'd sworn never to use for herself. "I need time to consider," she managed. "Of course, 7 days should be sufficient." The judge tipped his hat politely. "I do hope you'll make the sensible choice, Mrs. Crow-Feather. These boys have been through enough trauma. It would be unfortunate if they had to endure more due to your pride." After he left, Eleanor found the boys huddled in the kitchen, having heard every word. Samuel's face was stone, but his hands were clenched into fists. "We should leave," he said flatly. "Tonight, before he comes back." "No," Eleanor said firmly. You're not running anymore. You can't afford $200, Thomas pointed out with devastating practicality. Your pension barely covers food for all of us. William looked up from where he'd been drawing on a scrap of paper. Grandmother says sometimes you have to spend everything to save everything. Eleanor stared at the child's drawing, a rough sketch of 4 figures holding hands in front of a house, with dark storm clouds overhead but bright sunlight breaking through. In the corner he'd written a single word in careful letters: family. That night, Eleanor knelt beside the loose floorboard and counted Jacob's money by lamplight. $2,847, enough to pay the judge and still have money left for food, clothing, everything the boys would need. But touching this money felt like betraying Jacob's memory, like profiting from his death. Yet his last words echoed in her mind. Help the children, no one else will help. Maybe this was what he'd meant all along. Eleanor's investigation began at dawn the next morning. While the boys still slept, she rode into Silverton with a purpose that burned brighter than her fear. The Territorial Records Office sat in a cramped room above the general store, presided over by a nervous clerk named Henderson, who jumped whenever someone entered. I need to see records of child placements, Eleanor told him, sliding a silver dollar across his desk. Official business. Henderson's eyes darted toward the door. Judge Blackwood's orders are that those files remain confidential. Eleanor placed another dollar on the desk. My boys were processed through this office. I have a right to understand their legal status. The clerk's resistance crumbled. Within an hour, Eleanor sat surrounded by manila folders that painted a horrifying picture. 47 children had been processed through Judge Blackwood's court in the past 2 years. The destinations made her stomach turn. Copper mines in Arizona, textile mills in Denver, domestic placements that looked suspiciously like slavery. Each file contained financial records showing the judge receiving payments ranging from $25 to $50 per child. The documentation was meticulous, legal, and completely monstrous. Children as young as 7 had been bound to 10-year labor contracts with no provision for education, medical care, or basic safety. Sweet Jesus, Henderson whispered, reading over her shoulder. I just filed the papers. I didn't know what they meant. Eleanor found more silver dollars in her purse. I need copies of everything. Meanwhile, life at the cabin had begun to settle into rhythms that felt almost normal. Eleanor taught the boys to read using Jacob's collection of books, while they taught her practical skills she'd never expected to need. Samuel showed her how to identify which mine shafts were stable and which were dangerous, knowledge that spoke to trauma no 12-year-old should possess. Thomas had an almost supernatural connection with her old horse Thunder, and soon had the aging mare responding to whistle commands and hand signals. William continued to have his grandmother dreams, which Eleanor was beginning to understand weren't supernatural at all, but rather the hyper-vigilant awareness of a child who'd learned to read adults' hidden intentions for survival. When he said grandmother sees trouble coming, he was really saying that he'd noticed patterns in behavior, sounds in the distance, or changes in the wind that indicated danger. The boys threw themselves into making the cabin feel like home, with a desperate intensity that broke Eleanor's heart. They repaired loose shingles without being asked, gathered firewood with military precision, and maintained the small vegetable garden with the careful attention of people who understood that food security meant survival. Thomas discovered a small herd of wild mustangs that grazed in the high meadow behind the cabin. Within days, he'd gained their trust enough that they would approach when he whistled. Eleanor watched from the porch as he sat perfectly still while a young stallion ate grass from his outstretched hand, and she understood that this gift with animals was probably what had kept him alive in places where kindness was rare. Samuel's protective instincts manifested in different ways. He slept closest to the door, always positioning himself between the younger boys and any potential threat. He'd taken to carrying a knife, not to threaten, but to reassure himself that he could protect his makeshift family if needed. Eleanor allowed it, understanding that healing sometimes required holding on to the tools that had ensured survival. The financial reality of supporting 3 growing boys on $50 a month forced Eleanor to become creative. She expanded her herb gathering, walking farther into the mountains to find the rare plants that wealthy Silverton families paid premium prices for. Dried sage, wild mint, and mountain tea became her primary source of income beyond the pension. But the community's response to her new family was mixed at best. Mrs. Henderson from the general store whispered loudly about that Indian woman collecting strays, while other townspeople simply stared with the kind of hostility that made Eleanor's skin crawl. The boys felt it too, the way conversations stopped when they entered rooms, the way children were pulled closer to their mother's skirts when they passed. 3 weeks after Judge Blackwood's visit, Eleanor made a disturbing discovery. While trading herbs at Miller's Pharmacy, she overheard Dr. Marcus Ashford speaking quietly with another man about processing delays and missing inventory. When he noticed Eleanor listening, his face went pale. That evening, Dr. Ashford appeared at Eleanor's door under the pretense of checking on the boy's health. He was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and hands that shook slightly as he examined each child with perfunctory attention. "They seem healthy enough," he concluded, but his eyes held secrets. As he prepared to leave, he lingered at the door. "Mrs. Crowfeather, may I speak frankly?" Eleanor nodded, though every instinct told her to be wary. "You're not the first person to try to help these children," he said quietly. "There have been others, families, who thought they could make a difference. They don't live in Silverton anymore." The threat was delivered gently, almost apologetically, but Eleanor felt its weight. "Are you warning me, Doctor?" "I'm advising you, as someone who's seen what happens when people interfere with established systems." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Judge Blackwood has powerful friends. The territorial governor, mining companies, railroad interests. This isn't just about 3 boys, Mrs. Crowfeather. This is about a business that's worth thousands of dollars." After he left, Eleanor found herself staring at the hidden money beneath the floorboards with new understanding. $200 to keep the boys wasn't a fee. It was extortion, and paying it would make her complicit in a system that destroyed children for profit. That night, as the boys slept by the fire, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, writing letters by lamplight, one to her distant cousin in Denver, who worked for the territorial newspaper, another to the federal marshal in Colorado Springs, a third to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, documenting the illegal trafficking of Native American children. She wrote until her hand cramped, pouring out everything she'd learned from the files, everything the boys had told her about their experiences, everything she suspected about Judge Blackwood's operation. If she was going to fight this system, she needed allies beyond the borders of Silverton. William woke before dawn and found her still writing. He climbed into her lap without speaking, his small body warm against her chest. "Grandmother says you're scared," he whispered. Eleanor smoothed his dark hair. "I am scared, little one, but being scared doesn't mean we stop fighting. Will you send us away?" The question pierced her heart. "Never. You're my family now." William considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "Then we fight together?" Eleanor thought about Judge Blackwood's threats, about Dr. Ashford's warnings, about the powerful men who profited from children's suffering. She thought about Jacob's insurance money and what he would have wanted her to do with it. She thought about 44 other children still trapped in a system that treated them as merchandise. Yes, she said finally. "We fight together." The next morning brought the first real test of that resolve. Eleanor woke to find Thomas standing at the window, his body rigid with tension. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "3 of them. Not the judge." Eleanor peered through the curtain and saw 3 men on horseback approaching at a leisurely pace. They weren't wearing badges or official clothes, but something about their casual confidence set off every alarm in her head. "Get dressed," she told the boys. "Quickly!" As she loaded Jacob's old rifle, Eleanor realized that Judge Blackwood's 7-day deadline hadn't been a courtesy. It had been a countdown, and time was up. The riders stopped just outside her fence line, close enough to be threatening but far enough to claim they were merely passing through. The leader, a man with a silver tooth that caught the morning light, tipped his hat politely. "Morning, ma'am. Lovely place you have here. Be a shame if anything happened to it." Eleanor stepped onto her porch with the rifle cradled in her arms, not pointing at anyone, but unmistakably present. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm afraid I don't have time for visitors today." "Oh, we're not visiting," Silvertooth replied. "We're just making sure everyone in the valley stays safe. Lot of accidents can happen to folks living so far from town. Fires, mostly. Sometimes people get hurt trying to fight fires all by themselves." The message was clear. Pay up or face the consequences. Eleanor felt the boys behind her, could sense their fear and rage in equal measure. But she also felt something else, a cold, determined fury that reminded her of her grandmother's stories about Lakota women who fought to protect their children. "I appreciate your concern," she said evenly, "but as you can see, we're quite safe here." Silvertooth's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "For now, ma'am. For now." The Harvest Festival had always been Silverton's proudest tradition, a celebration where the entire community gathered in the town square to display the fruits of their labor and give thanks for another year of prosperity. This year, Eleanor decided it would serve a different purpose entirely. She spent the morning preparing with military precision, her hands steady as she loaded Jacob's rifle and checked the cylinder of his old revolver. The boys watched her with the quiet intensity of soldiers preparing for battle, understanding without words that everything they'd built together hung in the balance of the next few hours. "Remember the plan," Eleanor said as they climbed into the wagon. "Stay close, but not too close. If things go wrong, Thomas, you get William to the railroad station. Samuel, you know what to do with the evidence." Samuel patted the leather satchel containing copies of all the court documents Eleanor had gathered. If the worst happened, these papers would find their way to the territorial newspaper, even if none of them lived to see justice done. The town square buzzed with the controlled chaos of celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of preserves and baked goods. Children ran between booths with sticky fingers and bright smiles, and the brass band from the mining company played patriotic songs with enthusiastic imprecision. Eleanor's arrival with the 3 boys created the kind of ripple effect she'd expected, conversations stopping mid-sentence, mothers pulling their children closer, men touching the brims of their hats in acknowledgement that somehow felt more like warning. Judge Blackwood materialized from the crowd like smoke given form, his black coat immaculate despite the dust and his smile as sharp as broken glass. Behind him stood 2 men Eleanor didn't recognize, one wearing a territorial marshal's badge, the other carrying a leather portfolio that screamed official business. "Mrs. Crow Feather," the judge said pleasantly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "How wonderful to see you participating in our community celebration. And you brought the boys. How thoughtful." Eleanor positioned herself so that her back was to the large platform where the band had been playing. The boys flanked her, close enough for protection, but far enough to avoid being grabbed easily. "Judge Blackwood, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Oh, I wouldn't miss the Harvest Festival for anything. It's such a perfect opportunity to address community business." He gestured to the marshal. Marshal Williams here has come all the way from Colorado Springs to help us resolve that little matter we discussed." The marshal stepped forward, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he actually believed in justice. "Ma'am, I have a court order here for the immediate transfer of these 3 minors to territorial custody pending resolution of their legal status." Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but she kept her voice steady. "I'd like to see that order, Marshal." As he reached for his portfolio, William suddenly swayed on his feet. Eleanor caught him as he seemed to collapse, his small body going limp in her arms. The crowd pressed closer, concerned murmurs rising as the child appeared to be having some kind of seizure. Then William's eyes rolled back, and when he spoke, his voice was different, older, rougher, speaking in the cadence of an elderly Lakota woman. "Sarah Whitfield was 7 years old when you sent her to the Denver mills. She lost 3 fingers to the machinery before her first winter was over." The crowd stirred uneasily. Eleanor felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, even as she understood this was William's greatest performance yet, the traumatized child using the adult's own superstitions against them. "Tommy Burns was 8 when you placed him in the Arizona copper mines," William continued in that eerie voice. "He died of lung fever after 6 months breathing poison air. His mother is here today. She thinks he ran away." A woman in the crowd cried out. Mrs. Burns, Eleanor realized, whose son had indeed disappeared 2 years ago. "Tommy! Where is my Tommy?" Judge Blackwood stepped forward angrily. "This is ridiculous superstition. The child is clearly disturbed." But William wasn't finished. Still speaking in that otherworldly voice, he began reciting details that only the families of missing children would know. Pet names, favorite songs, the last words spoken before disappearance. With each revelation, the crowd grew more agitated. "Doctor." Ashford pushed through the gathering, his face pale as death. When he reached the center, he dropped to his knees beside Eleanor and pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "I have medical records, evidence of abuse, children with broken bones, malnutrition, injuries that could only come from forced labor." The dam burst. Dr. Ashford's confession triggered a cascade of revelations as other townspeople stepped forward. The railroad conductor produced transport logs showing children shipped like cargo to mining camps and textile mills. A clerk from the telegraph office revealed messages between Judge Blackwood and his business partners discussing inventory and processing delays. Marshal Williams looked stunned as the evidence mounted around him. "Judge Blackwood, these are serious allegations. I'm going to need to see all your court records immediately." But the judge was beyond pretense now. His carefully maintained facade cracked completely as he realized his empire was collapsing in real time. "These people don't understand," he snarled. "I was saving these children, giving them purpose. Work builds character. It makes them useful instead of letting them rot on the streets." "Useful to whom?" Eleanor demanded, standing with William still in her arms. The boy had recovered from his episode and was watching the proceedings with ancient eyes. "To the territory! To civilization!" Judge Blackwood's voice rose to near hysteria. "My son died in a mine because I failed to teach him discipline, failed to prepare him for the real world. These Indian children face the same fate unless someone teaches them to work, to contribute, to earn their place in society." The crowd recoiled from his words, finally understanding the twisted logic that had driven his crimes. Samuel stepped forward, his young face set with determination that belonged on a much older person. "Your son died because mine owners care more about profits than safety," he said clearly. "Just like you care more about money than children's lives." Thunder's hoofbeats suddenly echoed through the square as Thomas brought Eleanor's horse charging through the crowd, scattering people and creating chaos. In the confusion, he scattered papers from his saddlebags, copies of every document Eleanor had gathered, financial records showing the judge's profits, medical reports documenting abuse. Marshal Williams bent to gather the scattered evidence, his face growing darker with each page. Judge Joshua Blackwood, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, and violation of federal laws regarding the treatment of minors. As the handcuffs clicked around the judge's wrists, he looked directly at Eleanor with eyes full of broken fury. You think you've won something? This network has roots deeper than one territorial judge. They'll come for you. They'll come for all of you. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. Let them come. We'll be ready. The crowd erupted in cheers and angry shouts as the judge was led away. But Eleanor felt no celebration. William tugged at her sleeve, his small face serious. Grandmother says this is just the beginning, he whispered. The real fight starts now. Eleanor looked around at the scattered papers, the shocked faces, the marshal taking statements from townspeople. 47 children were still missing, still trapped in a system that treated them as merchandise. The judge's arrest was just the first step in a much longer journey. But for the first time since Jacob's death, Eleanor felt truly alive. Victory tasted like ashes in Eleanor's mouth 3 days after Judge Blackwood's arrest. The celebration had been premature, she realized, as the true cost of defying the system began to reveal itself with brutal clarity. The first blow came in the form of an eviction notice, delivered by a nervous clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. The bank claimed Jacob's life insurance payment had been irregularly obtained and demanded immediate repayment of $2,800, money Eleanor had finally used to secure legal representation for the boys. Without those funds, she couldn't prove ownership of the cabin or the land Jacob had purchased with his mining wages. 30 days, the clerk mumbled, dropping the papers on her kitchen table. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Eleanor stared at the official seal, understanding with sick certainty that Judge Blackwood's powerful friends were more numerous and vindictive than she'd imagined. The judge himself might be in territorial prison awaiting trial, but his network was very much alive and intent on revenge. The boys absorbed this news with the stoic resignation of children who'd learned not to expect stability. Samuel immediately began calculating distances to other towns, escape routes through the mountains, survival strategies for winter weather. Thomas started gathering supplies with military efficiency, rope, blankets, dried food, anything portable that might keep them alive on the road. William simply climbed into Eleanor's lap and said quietly, Grandmother says, sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what's really important. The second blow came from an unexpected source. Dr. Ashford appeared at Eleanor's door on a gray Thursday morning, his face haggard with sleepless nights and guilt. But instead of offering support, he brought devastating news. The territorial authorities have overruled Marshal Williams, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. New orders came from Colorado Springs yesterday. The boys are to be separated and placed in different institutions immediately. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. On what grounds? They're claiming you lack the financial resources to properly care for 3 children. Dr. Ashford's hands shook as he pulled out official documents. Without the insurance money, without the cabin, you're technically homeless. The Territorial Child Welfare Board has ruled that institutional care is in their best interests. The cruelest irony was that the system was using Eleanor's poverty, created by her fight against child trafficking, as justification for taking the children away. Samuel would be sent to a government boarding school in New Mexico. Thomas faced placement at a ranch in Wyoming that needed experienced hands with horses. William, deemed mentally unstable due to his spiritual sensitivity, was bound for an asylum in Denver. When? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. Tomorrow morning. 3 different wagons, 3 different destinations. Dr. Ashford couldn't look at her. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I tried to argue against it, but they say my testimony is compromised because of my association with Judge Blackwood's operation. That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch watching the boys play by the creek one last time. Thomas had taught Thunder to splash in the shallow water while William laughed with the pure joy of a child who'd forgotten for just a moment how cruel the world could be. Samuel sat apart, whittling a piece of pine into something that might become a bird or might become a weapon depending on what tomorrow required. The conversation she dreaded came after supper, when the boys sat around the kitchen table with faces that seemed years older than they'd been just weeks ago. We could run, Samuel said matter-of-factly. I know places in the mountains where they'd never find us, caves, abandoned mine shafts. We could survive until spring, maybe longer. Thomas nodded eagerly. The Mustangs would help us. They know water sources, safe paths through the high country. But William shook his head, his small face grave with premature wisdom. Running just means we spend our whole lives looking over our shoulders. And what about the other children? The ones still trapped in mines and mills? Eleanor's heart broke at the impossible burden of responsibility these children carried. They were thinking beyond their own survival, beyond their own safety, to the bigger fight that had consumed her own life. There's something else, she said quietly, pulling out the letters she'd been writing by lamplight for the past 3 days. I've been corresponding with people in Denver, Colorado Springs, even Washington. Judge Blackwood's arrest has started an investigation, but it's going to take time, maybe years. Samuel looked up from his whittling. How much time? Long enough for you to grow up in institutions that will try to break everything that makes you who you are. Eleanor's voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. Long enough for them to succeed in destroying the family we've built together. The silence stretched between them like a wound. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like mourning, and Eleanor realized she was about to lose the only thing that had given her life meaning since Jacob's death. William slipped from his chair and pressed something into her hand, a small carving of 4 figures holding hands, their faces turned toward a rising sun. Grandmother says this isn't the end, he whispered. She says sometimes people have to be apart before they can choose to be together forever. Eleanor closed her fingers around the carving and wondered if faith alone would be enough to survive what was coming. Spring came to Colorado like a resurrection, melting winter's grip on the mountains and bringing with it a letter that would change everything. Eleanor sat in her rented room above Miller's Pharmacy, the only lodging she could afford after losing the cabin, and stared at the envelope bearing the seal of the Denver Federal Marshal's office. 6 months had passed since the boys were taken. 6 months of silence, of unanswered letters to institutions that claimed no knowledge of Samuel Running Bear, Thomas Swift Arrow, or William Little Wolf. 6 months of Eleanor surviving on herb sales and the charity of townspeople who'd witnessed her stand against Judge Blackwood. 6 months of believing she'd failed the only family she'd ever truly had. The letter trembled in her hands as she read, Mrs. Crow Feather, federal investigation has uncovered extensive evidence of child trafficking network. Judge Blackwood's records led to raids on 17 facilities across 4 territories. 31 children recovered alive. Your 3 boys escaped institutional custody using skills you taught them. They are safe and requesting reunion. Report to Denver Federal Building immediately. Marshal Thomas Henderson, Federal Child Welfare Division. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before the words penetrated her grief-numbed mind. Alive. Safe. Escaped. The boys had survived, and more than that, they'd found their way back to her. The train to Denver felt like the longest journey of her life, even though it lasted only 6 hours. Eleanor clutched the letter and William's carved figures, replaying every moment of their separation. Every night she'd lain awake wondering if they were warm, fed, safe. The guilt had nearly destroyed her. The knowledge that her fight for justice had cost the children their security, their home, their innocence. The Denver Federal Building was an imposing structure of red brick and granite that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. But when Eleanor stepped into Marshall Henderson's office, she found herself face to face with a middle-aged man whose gentle eyes suggested he understood the weight of broken families. "Mrs. Crow-Feather," he said, rising from his desk. "I'm glad you came so quickly." "Where are they?" Eleanor asked without preamble. "Are they really safe?" Marshall Henderson smiled, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from a government official in months. "They're more than safe. They're remarkable. Would you like to see them?" He led her through a maze of corridors to a room that looked more like a comfortable parlor than a government office. And there, seated around a table covered with maps and documents, were her boys. Samuel had grown taller in 6 months, his shoulders broader, his face carrying the weight of experiences Eleanor could only imagine. Thomas moved with a new confidence, his connection to animals having apparently served him well during their escape. But it was William who stole her breath, still small, still carrying ancient wisdom in his young eyes but alive and whole, and reaching for her with arms that remembered being loved. The reunion was a tangle of tears and laughter, of hands checking for injuries and voices overlapping with stories that tumbled out like water breaking through a dam. Samuel spoke of the boarding school's attempt to kill the Indian in him, of forced haircuts and forbidden languages, of the night he picked the lock on his dormitory and disappeared into the New Mexico desert. Thomas described the Wyoming ranch where they'd tried to break his spirit along with wild horses, where his gift with animals had made him valuable enough to keep alive but dangerous enough to watch constantly. He'd escaped during a spring roundup, stealing a horse and riding 300 miles with nothing but determination and the memory of Eleanor's faith in him. William's story was the most heartbreaking. The Denver asylum had diagnosed his spiritual sensitivity as mental illness, subjecting him to treatments designed to eliminate his hallucinations. But his grandmother's voice had never left him, guiding him through locked corridors and security protocols until he found his way to freedom. "We found each other in Colorado Springs," Samuel explained. "Started looking for the other children from Judge Blackwood's network. We've been helping the federal marshals track down the facilities, identify the victims." Marshall Henderson nodded approvingly. "These boys have provided intelligence that led to the rescue of dozens of children. They've become valuable assets in our investigation." But Eleanor barely heard him. She was studying the faces of her boys, seeing new scars alongside familiar features, recognizing the way trauma had aged them beyond their years. They'd survived, but at what cost? "The investigation isn't over," Marshall Henderson continued. "Judge Blackwood was just one piece of a much larger network. We've identified connections to mining companies, textile manufacturers, even some territorial politicians. This case could take years to fully prosecute." William tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, his small voice cutting through the official discussion. "Grandmother says we can go home now. The real home, the one we choose together." Eleanor looked around the government office, at the marshal with his good intentions and official procedures, at her boys who'd survived hell to find their way back to her. "Where is home?" she asked quietly. Samuel answered without hesitation. "Wherever we're together." But Marshall Henderson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mrs. Crowfeather, there's something else you need to know. The federal government has authorized funding for an official children's sanctuary program. We need someone to run a facility for rescued children, someone with experience, someone these kids trust." He spread documents across the table, property deeds, funding authorizations, staffing requirements. "There's a ranch outside Colorado Springs, 200 acres, fully equipped. The federal government will provide operational funding and legal protection. You'd be serving as an official federal agent for child welfare. Eleanor stared at the papers, hardly believing what she was seeing. You're offering me a job? We're offering you a chance to make Judge Blackwood's defeat permanent, Marshal Henderson replied, to ensure that what happened to your boys never happens to other children. To build something that can't be destroyed by corrupt judges or vindictive politicians. Thomas grinned, the first real smile Eleanor had seen from him since their reunion. We could help more kids like us. Kids who need a family. Samuel nodded slowly. The grandmother's spirits were right. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were really meant to do. William pressed his carved figures into Eleanor's palm one more time. Home isn't a place, he said with the wisdom of someone far older than his 8 years. Home is people who choose to love each other no matter what. Eleanor closed her fingers around the wooden family and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. 5 years later, Eleanor Crow Feather stood on the wraparound porch of the Sanctuary Ranch, watching the sun paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard where 23 young souls played before supper, some recently rescued from trafficking networks, others who'd grown up here and now helped with the newer arrivals. The ranch had become everything Marshal Henderson had promised and more. 200 acres of rolling grassland provided space for gardens, livestock, and the kind of freedom that allowed traumatized children to remember what safety felt like. The main house had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing family, while smaller cabins dotted the property for older children who needed their own space as they prepared for independent life. Samuel, now 17, emerged from the barn with dirt on his clothes and pride in his eyes. He'd become the ranch's unofficial foreman, teaching younger children everything from animal husbandry to basic carpentry. His selective mutism had evolved into thoughtful speech. He chose his words carefully, but when he spoke, everyone listened. "The new mare is settling in well," he reported, climbing the porch steps. "Tommy thinks she'll be perfect for the therapy program." Thomas, 15 now, and officially known as the ranch's horse whisperer, had developed their equine therapy program into something that drew visitors from across the territory. Children who couldn't speak about their trauma somehow found their voices while working with rescued Mustangs who understood abandonment and fear. William, 13, but still carrying ancient wisdom in his dark eyes, looked up from the book he was reading to the younger children. "Mrs. Rodriguez says Miguel spoke his first word today," he announced. "He asked for water." In English. Miguel was one of the newest arrivals, a 7-year-old rescued from a textile mill in New Mexico where speaking Spanish had been beaten out of him along with most of his trust in adults. The fact that he'd spoken at all was a miracle. That he'd spoken to ask for help was a breakthrough that made Eleanor's heart sing. Dr. Marcus Ashford climbed down from his medical wagon, his weekly visit to the ranch having become one of his favorite professional duties. His own daughter, recovered from her ordeal at the textile mill, now worked as Eleanor's assistant and had married Samuel the previous spring in a ceremony that brought together Lakota traditions with federal officials and former trafficking victims in a celebration of chosen family. "How's our patient?" Eleanor asked, referring to the newest arrival, a 10-year-old Ute boy found chained in a basement mine operation near Leadville. "Physically, he's healing well, Dr. Ashford replied, his voice carrying the weight of too much experience with such cases. "Emotionally, it's going to take time, but he's in the right place for that kind of healing." Eleanor nodded, understanding better than most that some wounds took years to mend. The ranch operated on what she'd come to call healing time, not the rushed schedule of institutions or the artificial deadlines of bureaucrats, but the organic rhythm of trust building and soul mending. The dinner bell rang, calling the children in from their various activities. Eleanor watched them stream toward the main house. Former mine workers walking beside rescued domestics, native children reclaiming their languages alongside immigrant children learning English, teenagers who'd aged out of other systems finding purpose in protecting younger ones. At the long wooden table that could seat 30, grace was said in 6 different languages before the meal began. This was Eleanor's favorite time of day, when the chaos of individual healing gave way to the peaceful communion of shared family. Stories were told, small victories celebrated, problems worked through collectively. "Tell us about the old days again," requested Sarah, a 14-year-old who'd been rescued from a Denver brothel and now helped Eleanor with administrative duties. "About when there were only 4 of you." Eleanor smiled, settling into the story she'd told dozens of times. "Well, it started with 3 boys who wore burlap sacks over their heads and a lonely widow who thought her life was over." As she spoke, Eleanor's eyes found the original family scattered around the table. Samuel sat with his wife and their infant daughter, the first baby born at the ranch, a symbol of hope and continuity. Thomas was teaching a group of younger children how to properly hold eating utensils, his patience infinite when it came to healing. William, now taller than Eleanor but still her little wolf, helped translate for children who hadn't yet learned English. After dinner, as the children settled into evening routines, Eleanor walked to the small cemetery at the edge of the property. 2 headstones stood there, one for Jacob, whose remains she'd moved from Silverton, and one for Judge Blackwood, who'd died in territorial prison the previous year. Eleanor had insisted on the second marker, not to honor the man, but to remember the lesson his life represented. Evil often wears the mask of good intentions, she'd told the children during the burial service. The judge truly believed he was helping children by forcing them to work. But good intentions without love, without respect for human dignity, become just another form of cruelty. Judge Blackwood's death had closed one chapter, but Eleanor knew the work was far from finished. The federal investigation had uncovered trafficking networks in 12 territories, leading to hundreds of arrests and the rescue of nearly 300 children. But for every child saved, others remained trapped in systems that valued their labor more than their lives. A letter had arrived that morning from Washington, D.C., offering Eleanor a position as Territorial Supervisor of Child Welfare, a role that would allow her to expand the sanctuary model across the Western Territories. It was an opportunity to ensure that what they'd built here could be replicated wherever children needed protection. William found her in the cemetery as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Grandmother says you're thinking about the letter." Eleanor smiled at his continued connection to spiritual guidance, no longer questioning whether his grandmother was mystical insight or exceptional intuition. "What does she say about it?" "She says the seedling has become a tree, and now it's time to scatter the seeds." William sat on Jacob's headstone with the casual irreverence of someone who'd learned not to fear death. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "This place is home. You children are my family. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, feels like tearing out my heart." "But the other children need families too," William pointed out with his trademark directness. "And we're not babies anymore. Samuel and his wife can run the ranch. Thomas knows more about healing than most adults. I can help translate not just languages but pain. We can take care of each other now." Eleanor studied his face in the starlight, seeing the boy who'd whispered her name in the town square and the young man who'd become a bridge between worlds. "When did you grow up?" "When I realized that families aren't things you find," William replied. "They're things you build. And once you build them strong enough, they can survive anything, even separation, even change." The next morning, Eleanor stood in the federal courthouse in Colorado Springs, raising her right hand to take the oath as Territorial Supervisor of Child Welfare. Samuel, Thomas, and William stood behind her, along with dozens of children whose lives had been transformed by the sanctuary model. Do you solemnly swear to protect and defend the welfare of all children under territorial jurisdiction, to ensure their safety, education, and fundamental human dignity, so help you God? I do, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of 5 years of learning that love could triumph over systems, that chosen families could be stronger than biological ones, that sometimes the most broken people were perfectly equipped to heal others. As she signed the official documents, Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been before that day in Silverton's town square. Lonely, purposeless, convinced her life was over at 52. She thought about Jacob's words about helping children no one else would help, and how those words had become the foundation of everything that followed. The celebration that evening at the ranch was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. Federal officials shared stories with former trafficking victims, tribal elders blessed children from a dozen different nations, and the sound of laughter echoed across the mountains like a prayer of gratitude. William found Eleanor on the porch as the festivities wound down, carrying his carved wooden figures, now worn smooth by years of handling. "Grandmother says to tell you that home isn't a place you stay," he said, pressing the figures into her palm one final time. "Home is love you carry with you wherever you go." Eleanor closed her fingers around the carved family and felt the truth of his words settle in her bones. Tomorrow she would begin traveling the territories, establishing new sanctuaries, fighting new battles against systems that devalued children's lives. But tonight, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her in return, she was complete. The widow who'd bought 3 orphans with sacks over their heads had become the mother of a movement that would protect generations of children yet to come. And somewhere in the distance she could swear she heard the voice of William's grandmother, carried on the mountain wind, whispering words of blessing for the road ahead. Family, Eleanor had learned, wasn't made by blood or law or money. Family was made by the choice to love unconditionally, to protect fiercely, and to never give up on each other. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that choice could change the world. At 67, I understand the ache of an empty nest, the silence that fills rooms once echoing with family life. Eleanor's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. When she thought her purpose died with her husband, 3 abandoned children whispered her name and changed everything. Like many of us, Eleanor had spent decades believing her value diminished with age, that her best years were behind her. But sometimes God closes one door to open a window we never expected to climb through. Eleanor discovered that the family we choose can be stronger than the family we're born into. Her empty house became a sanctuary for dozens of children who needed exactly what she had to offer. Not perfection, not wealth, but unconditional love and fierce protection. She learned that our deepest wounds often prepare us for our greatest purpose. The woman who couldn't have children became mother to hundreds. Her loneliness became the foundation for healing others' abandonment. Perhaps you felt invisible, forgotten, like your contributions no longer matter. Eleanor's journey proves that our capacity to love and nurture doesn't expire at 50, 60, or beyond. Sometimes the most broken hearts mend strongest, ready to shelter others. What dream have you set aside that might still be calling your name? Have you ever felt that your greatest purpose was waiting on the other side of your deepest loss? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.